Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Abdul Chauhan. I'm the VP of Learning at Shobi. Shobi is a hybrid learning platform used for assessment and feedback by over 3 million educators around the world. And today I'm kind of quite excited to have Jim Knight with us. Jim and I think we've traveled together, Jim. I think we've done a couple of events together.
We've certainly bumped into each other around the world, Abdul, and I'm just as excited as you are.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So I think Jim doesn't really need introductions, but for those of you that might not know of Jim, his full title is Lord Jim Knight. He's a member of the House of Lords. He's a chair of various organizations, including the Multi-Academy Trust EACT. He's Chief Education External Officer at TES Global. He's a visiting professor at the London Knowledge Lab of the Institute of Education in London. He's also chair of the Digital Poverty Alliance as well. And I also know that Jim has some involvement as well, chair of an organization that looks at technology in healthcare as well. So Jim, wonderful to have you with us on your 4G connection on your laptop. Seems to be working and seems to be pretty good.
Yeah,
Great to have you here.
Here from sunny Orkney, which
wonderful.
is lovely. I'm looking out at the sea there. See?
Oh wow, that looks amazing. But I'm in kind of rainy Bolton, and I'm not going to turn my camera around because it's not the same view and so on. But hey, Jim, thanks for making the time. I know we have 30 minutes. I could spend a long time chatting to you. I think if I remember rightly, the last time we met was in China. We bumped into each other just suddenly.
Yeah, you were coming out of one of those revolving doors in a hotel, and I was going in, I think.
Yeah, I feel that was the last time anyway, before all the madness. But kind of talking, like just kind of getting into conversation and your thoughts. Let's talk education. Obviously, we kind of have been through, 18 months of pandemic, close downs, rules, regulation changes, and so on. What are your thoughts on how, is there going to be an effect of the pandemic long-term on education?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm confident that there will. Partly, the disruption of the pandemic has reminded people of what they really want to keep and what they really want to focus on, but it's also shown them that they've got the capacity to innovate, teachers, and they had to learn how to do some stuff they were really uncomfortable with really quickly, and they rose to the challenge by and large. So it will, I think, have permanently accelerated the use of technology. I also hope and suspect that it might have changed the game in terms of people's thinking about holistically how the child develops. We've got rightly an emphasis on well-being because of the huge spike in mental health problems amongst children and young people. That was bad enough going into the pandemic, but that has also been accelerated by the pandemic. And I think, and again, I hope that will be a permanent change where those working in schools are even more mindful of the mindfulness, if you like, of children, and making sure that they're looking after the emotional development and well-being as well as the cognitive and social well-being of children.
Yeah, absolutely. And I for certain, I think for someone like myself that's kind of, been very closely attached and kind of had a very steep learning curve in the early days of, implementing technology in education, it was kind of quite interesting to see how teachers rose to that challenge. And I think, by and large, as far as teachers are concerned, if it's the best for their students, they'll kind of make that happen. And I've heard some kind of really amazing stories of how, teachers kind of went through this, like they had their own children at home, they had classes on the go at the same time. They had to worry about their own kind of shopping and day-to-day stuff that they need to do and all of that. And they were kind of, still running.
I had a really interesting conversation with deputy head teachers from primary schools in Somerset. So quite niche, but an interesting group. And I was talking to them about what they wanted to keep, what they really enjoyed about from pandemic or had learned from the pandemic. And undoubtedly, technology was a big part. I mean, and incidentally, they all wanted to do more forest schooling. So they all wanted more of a connection with nature and the environment, which is almost the opposite of the technology. Yeah. But they saw the huge workflow gains from using technology sensibly. The relationship with home will have changed, partly using Google Classroom. In most cases, they went with Google. Using Classroom more for homework, and that will be permanent. But also the relationship with parents will have changed permanently, I think. And things like parents' evenings will all go online. Well, not go online, but there'll be a much bigger use of online for parents' evenings. Reporting will have changed. We've seen an uptick in things like Class Dojo and so on. And then for teaching and learning itself, I think that's it's always going to be the most contested area.
Absolutely.
But, platforms like Century Tech, they've seen a big uplift. They gave it away during the first lockdown, but nevertheless, they've seen a huge gain for them in the use of AI for teaching and learning in math, science, and the SPAG elements of English. And so those platforms that have got things right for teaching and learning, teachers will have used them. They'll have used a whole bunch of others as well. They'll be more intelligent now about understanding what works and what doesn't in terms of having any kind of impact. And that will stay. And the last thing for now, anyway, on the technology impact from the pandemic, Gavin Williamson is not someone I tend to hang out with. He's not my best mate. We are on very much opposite sides of the political fence. But I was in a conversation with him as part of the all-party group on education technology in Parliament. And he said, and I was really pleased to hear him say it, the investment of several £100 million in devices for learning during the pandemic, they didn't see as a sticking plaster, just that would have an impact during the periods of lockdown. In his head, that had to have a return on that investment over a much longer period of time, and so that the sense of technology being used for learning in the department's mind now, I think, is permanent, and then in the Treasury's mind is permanent. Now that creates an expectation that they'll continue to fund some of it. And hopefully we can move to one-to-one devices, but we'll see.
And I think that, I mean, I've always been an advocate of that. Maybe I'll kind of might pick your brains on that later on, but that's really heartening to hear. I mean, for me, it's quite an interesting experience. When the lockdown first happened, I was doing webinars for Shobi at the time. My kind of work with schools in different places and flying around kind of stuff stopped. And there was webinars that I was doing, and it was, what was fascinating was that because Shobi is focusing purely on assessment and feedback, digitized verbal feedback, and you can still submit work, handwritten stuff, but you can give verbal feedback. That seemed to kind of resonate with teachers. And what I was doing 6 webinars a day, and this really blew me away. And I've been traveling and working with schools and so on. I was doing 6 webinars a day. On each webinar, there was, I think we had a capacity of 500 people, and in each webinar, there was 500 people on there, and there were teachers from everywhere.
And actually, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned assessment, because that's the other area where it's going to be contested, but it may be that things have changed. Peter Hyman wrote an interesting piece in The Observer this weekend, because he's part of the rethinking assessment sort of movement. But I have a strong belief and a strong sense that we have become fixated on one particular form of summative assessment, and we use it far too much, and we're over testing children as far as that form of assessment is concerned. Good assessment is always going to be part of good teaching, and learning.
Yeah.
But that will be mostly assessment for learning. It'll be forms of formative assessment, and then there's a huge variety of assessment. And because of what's happened with the summer exams, and I don't think that's been Gavin Williamson's finest hour. But because what's happened, we've been asking teachers to brush off their assessment skills, which is not something they've really been trained that acutely for.
Yeah.
And so there has been that appetite, and you've seen it with Shobi. There's been that appetite to explore different forms of assessment other than papers and pens in large sports halls on tiny desks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's significant changes that are possible. I mean, for me, what's kind of interesting now is that the technology and the tools are there. It's the willingness for the system to change and for us to recognize that actually there is a need for that change. I mean, I've been working with some schools in Dubai, and we've been working on assessment policies. And so it's not just about using the tools, but what does that policy look like, and what's the frequency of look like, and so on. And part of the assessment conversation that we've been having has really been very much about, if you don't know why you're assessing something, then should you actually be doing it? Like, where is that going? What's the point? I mean, it's got to either benefit the students in knowing actually, you've learned something, you haven't learned something, and these are the next steps that need to be put into place. But if it's not really being used and it's just part of a system, then why is it that,
and what's that particular form of assessment designed to do? Part of our problem, I think, and I'm, cards on the table, I'm just as guilty when I was schools minister as any other minister of repeating the same mistake. But we take, for accountability purposes, assessments like SATs that are done, and so they're used to the theory is they're being used not only for how well a child is doing, but also being able to compare the child to others, not only in their class and their school, but anyone across the country, and then used for accountability purposes for the system as a whole and for the school individually, and perhaps for other things. That's asking too much of single assessment. We should be exploring for accountability purposes. Accountability is really important for all of that public money, but why don't we just use sampling? We could save a bunch of money, and we can free up teachers to choose the right sort of assessment for their children and for the subjects that they're doing. And the accountability tests would just be done where a sample of kids do them, sufficient for it to be robust enough to know how things are going.
It sounds like a good idea. I mean, I've always, I don't know. I mean, my daughter's just gone through A levels, right? And obviously it was teacher assessment and so on. I remember when I did my A levels, I just kind of, I mean, it's a tough enough course as it is, and the amount of content you've got to learn and so on. But then the whole judgment is made in that 1.5 hours that I'm going to sit that paper, and based on how I feel, I just feel like that is just so unfair and not a true reflection of, a child's kind of experience or a child's performance or understanding of learning. And the other thing is that nobody does that in the real world. I mean, that doesn't, like, no one's going to make you do that again, ever. And I do feel that, certainly it does need to be explored in terms of how we kind of look at this in a fresh way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no doubt in my mind that the decision that was made by Michael Gove pretty soon after the coalition came in after the 2010 election to move away from the phrase has gone out of my head, from assessing work alongside exams. What's the phrase? It's escaped me.
The coursework kind of
coursework. Yeah, of course. So that, I think, was the wrong decision. I think there's a balance to be had between the two. There is certainly a place for testing how well people perform under pressure.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that. But if that's all it is, then that's just going to advantage some people.
Yeah.
And normally they're going to be people who are already advantaged in the first place. And then,
Absolutely.
and it's not going to give you a fair assessment of people. Now, what we've seen as a result of the way the exams have been run for the last 2 years, I think, particularly this last summer, I think that's been unfair on teachers, because they've been having, last year it was centre assessed grades, this year it's teacher assessed grades. Now that's quite a big difference, because that's now your daughter looking at her grade, I'm sure she did brilliantly, and going, my teacher gave me that grade. It's not my school, my teacher. And if the teacher didn't give me what I wanted, then there's an issue there between the relationship between the student and the teacher, particularly if they are to carry on learning in that school. And obviously there's a workload pressure and so on. If we can instead have more of a system where we're working with teachers around the work that's done through the lifetime of the course, with then some moment of a more high pressure exam at the end of it to kind of moderate against some of that coursework, there's a balance there that I think is more sensible.
True. So Jim, something a little bit different, just coming on to kind of like hybrid learning, okay?
Yeah.
And where learning can happen. What do you feel the potential impact on the future of education in terms of, where learning can happen? Because like you mentioned that, for a long time, it was always in the classroom and you kind of had to be there. I feel like obviously going through the pandemic, lots of things have changed, but, should this be something that's integral as part of a multi-academy trust digital strategy and approach, the fact that, we can look at where learning and with that in mind, also the flexibility that potentially technology can provide for teachers as well. So I don't know, your kind of thoughts on that.
Well, I think those schools, those groups where I think the most exciting work happened in response to the pandemic, generally were those that had already embedded a certain amount of technology, so they were much more comfortable with it, both as teachers and learners, but they then had the space to innovate some more. But the most exciting were they properly got the flexibility of time and place for learning. And we all learn all the time. We're born learning. That's what we're hardwired to do, and we'll carry on doing it forever. The question is whether or not you formalize some of that informal learning and the learning that we all, the cliche would be that there have been too many children who go to school to have a rest from the learning that they do the rest of the time. And it's the formalized stuff that didn't engage them. But they were very happy learning. They might not be learning stuff we wanted them to learn, but they'd certainly be learning stuff at home, online, through their phones, etc., etc. Why wouldn't you carry on wanting to take advantage of that, wanting to take advantage of how engaging some of the learning design is in things like games, and the intuitive nature of the way that a lot of young people will use their own technology, their personal technology, to find stuff out. They don't think of it as learning, so as long as you don't label it as learning. But thinking about some of that design, thinking about the engagement, thinking about that time when they're not in school and how you can manage that better. And then obviously there are kids who, for all sorts of reasons, might not be in school, but they still need to carry on learning. So finding ways of, there's a lot of development that needs to be done of the profession to help them with this, because the hybridization, I think, is much harder than everyone online or obviously everyone face-to-face. Involves developing some new pedagogies. Just trying to replicate the face-to-face pedagogy online is never going to be as good as face-to-face. But trying to replicate it as a hybrid form is definitely never going to be as good. You've got to find some different pedagogies, and pioneers like yourself, Abdul, I think are really important within that. Because you've had all sorts of experience of how you might do this, and you're observing all over the world what people are up to, and so to have people like you who can lead some of the pedagogic thinking, I think is really, really key.
I think I completely agree with you, and I think that schools that had that kind of access, and I suppose this is kind of leading me on to my next question, which is around equity of access, but
Yeah.
not, and when I say equity of access, I'm not really just talking about a one-to-one program with technology. I think at one time, if you would have asked me some years ago, I probably would have said, yes, one-to-one, that's equity of access, but actually it needs to go beyond that. So the equity of access is not just the hardware technology, but actually access to feedback and assessment workflows outside the physical classroom. Yeah. So for me, that kind of it expands time in terms of learning. I mean, I just find it fascinating that we sat in 2021 and schools invest in technology on a large scale now with maths as well. And actually after school hours, most of that technology is sat in school doing nothing. Weekends is sat there doing nothing. Surely with the prices of devices coming down, technology getting better, and tools that allow for assessment and feedback, if you begin to join that up, surely we're going to be in a position. And now, you know, when we first started, when I first started doing technology one-to-one, there were all sorts of stuff about, you know, security and how do you make sure that, you know, you can kind of, you know, get devices kind of restricted and all that kind of stuff and so on. And now there's kind of like amazing solutions out there that almost work like magic. Like, you know, you can remove apps, you can geo-fence them, you can time fence them and all that kind of stuff. And I do feel that actually certainly with larger organizations, that strategy needs to change. So the equitable access part is actually the hardware, but also that workflow assessment and feedback stuff that's kind of built in to that. And then making use, so it's not just translated like still marking in books or just typing on a screen, but that verbalization here, I can speak, record my voice, leave a comment for you, you can speak back, and that kind of nature. And I feel like I'm feeling more and more strongly about that approach. Is something, and schools can choose, you know, whatever technology that they want to use. But I do feel that surely there has to be a kind of directional change, even a policy change from government in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. I was talking to a US company that's done a lot of work on digital equity. The US government's pandemic response funding for education included not only completing one-to-one, which you know, the US has done really well in the last 10, 11 years in rolling out one-to-one, largely to the benefit of Google, but they've also now added connectivity. So you know, they've got a much more complete solution. You know, here we had too many families competing over a single device for learning. We've now got the telecoms companies, you know, generosity, if you like, of allowing the data for certain types of learning sites to go through without a charge. That's going to come to an end, and you know, families having to choose between data and food is not a choice that they should have to make when it comes to learning. So in the US, there are good examples where you have devices with inbuilt connectivity that are then lent out from their school library to homes where they don't have them, for example. The hotspot devices, there's all sorts of different things that are being used. Those hotspot devices limited to certain sites, so or they're blocking out gambling, they're blocking out, you know, all the things that you would want to block out in order to make it safe. There are various solutions that are there. There are countries that are working through those solutions that we can learn from, and we absolutely have to do better than just giving out devices, which is kind of what happened with those few hundred million that that Gavin was talking about. When we did home access back in 2009-10, that was technology, connectivity, technical support, and online safety all wrapped up into a single package. Now, we probably needed to do a lot more on teacher development, so that then they were able to use that capacity that we were unleashing amongst 500,000 kids that benefited from that scheme. But that more rounded approach, I think, is what we need, updated and learning from what's going on internationally.
Yeah, I mean, we're running a trial at the moment in London with an organization where we're kind of, I mean, they're a Google organization, they're using Google devices and so on, they've been using Google Classroom and so on. But we're kind of running a bit of a pilot across there with the concept of verbal feedback and that kind of connection in a way in which the students and teachers can speak to one another, leave voice notes, be able to speak to one another, annotate documents in that way, and so on, which is quite interesting. But I think like there's a significant impact on things like teacher workload and what that workflow looks like. And I know teacher workload's being bandied about everywhere, and everyone's been kind of saying it, and it means different things to different people and so on. But certainly, feedback is a big area that teachers spend a lot of time on. And I think that, that there's a significant overhaul potentially that can be had over technology.
And you can tell me, Abdul, but my assumption is that if we have a much more embedded use of one-to-one devices for learning, then with the right design, the data that can be captured whilst those devices are being used can provide a lot of the feedback. So then teachers aren't bogged down either with data input or with feedback, because the technology can just give them the dashboard and they can do that much more easily on the fly.
Absolutely. I mean, it was really interesting, right? I'm the chair of an organization, Single Academy Trust, and one of the things that we asked for was about how many students are actually learning outside school hours, and you can get that by data that you get off the platform and so on. And there was another organization that I was working with as well. They happened to be using Shobi, and what we did was we just asked Shobi, just gave us the data of the use outside school hours, and it's significant. Like, you actually see children accessing videos, accessing tutorial stuff that teachers had uploaded on there. I mean, for me, it's the simplicity of some of these things, right? If I taught chemistry for many years, you had to be in my room at that time to learn about, organic chemistry. And if you miss that lesson, that's it. I'm not going to go through that again because I've got so much other stuff to cover. But we now live in a time where that's captured. It's there. You're there in person to ask me. You can watch it again. And everything that cognitive science is telling us about memory and learning, and the fact that you can you need to access things again and so on. I think like that workflow just kind of, it's something that has to be kind of looked at. And I think technology allows us to do a lot of those things that just simply weren't possible in the past. So, I mean, it's definitely doable at this moment in time.
Yeah, it's really exciting. The kind of as we shift the professional on the adoption curve. And the pandemic's massively helped with that. Then we can get the profession as a body working through how to do some of that and really taking advantage of what the technology can do to make the job easier, to free up teachers to focus more on the core human-to-human bit of their job, and motivating and engaging and exciting kids with their subject and with their learning, while the technology can take care of the drudgery, and that's the dream, and we can do that.
Absolutely. Jim, I've just kind of this always happens when I'm speaking with people like yourselves. You start the thing, and then I look back. I've got a ton of questions still left, and then it's like 11:29, and there's only a minute left. So I'm going to wrap up. But really, just one last question for you. Yeah, how flexible and prepared do you think the UK education system is for the future?
Well, look, the UK is actually 4 countries. I'm here in Scotland. Scotland and Wales have much more progressive, rounded curricula. I think they're in a better place, and Scotland's done some pretty good work in terms of technology adoption.
Yeah.
I think England, however, the current thinking in the DfE is pretty rigid about what it expects. And by and large, I think ministers want things to go back to the way they were. They haven't really thought through, they want technology to help deliver what has always happened rather than wanting to project forward. I've got a private members bill in Parliament at the moment to try and put sustainable development education at the core of the national curriculum. And they say we haven't got the time and the capacity to do that, and yet we have got the time and capacity to put Latin in schools. So we're happy to teach the past, but we're not happy to teach the future. And that tells you everything you need to know about the thinking that is going on in English policymakers' minds. And so, my fear is that England will be left behind by other countries, other jurisdictions, including others in the UK.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm actually in Scotland. I think next week we're going to be working with Maureen McKenna. She's the Director of Education for Glasgow City. Glasgow City uses all the schools use Shobi there, and Scottish Borders as well. So it's kind of been really interesting to see. And what was fascinating was that a lot of those schools had adopted that before the pandemic. And when now you speak to head teachers over there during the pandemic, actually, it wasn't as much of a blocker, and obviously they've done a big one-to-one rollout there as well. So that's kind of, in some ways, lots of great things to hear from you as well. But I hope, like from an England perspective as well, we can kind of push that. But there's some big multi-academic trusts moving in that direction as well. And
there are. Yeah, there's some really good practice going on. I'm just taking over the chair at EACT, and it's one of the things on my agenda there is how we more strategically use technology, and I'll work with Jane and her team around all of that. But I see it in other mats, I see it in some other schools that's really exciting. We just need to scale that up.
Wonderful. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy Bonnie, Scotland, and hopefully we will bump into one another again. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
Thanks.